Elected leader of the Progressive Conservative Party in 1983, Brian Mulroney challenged its members, instilling discipline and preparing his party to govern. He won 2 commanding majorities. He was Prime Minister. He was Prime Minister, and he would make it count. The Brian Mulroney that we saw from caucus and cabinet was, in the words of Theodore Roosevelt's famous speech of 1910, the man in the arena. Like that man, he was no timid soul who had never known victory or defeat. Brian Mulroney chose to spend his political capital. He took risks, and by doing so became one of those rarest of leaders, able to define an era as his own. He would remind us in caucus and cabinet that the number one task of any prime minister was to keep the country united. In 1984, national unity meant that we needed to heal the wounds of the past and initiate constitutional reforms to bring us together. The second most important task of a prime minister was managing Canada's relationship with our neighbors, friends, allies, and in particular with our most important economic partner, the United States. Not an easy challenge for any prime minister for whom the neighbor happens to be the world's #1 superpower. And so he dared. He dared to defy the long history of Canada and negotiated a free trade agreement with the Americans. And to get this done, he was subjected to the test of a grueling and a punishing election campaign. To win in 1988, he brought together Albertans and Quebecers to support free trade. He did so because he knew that to build a great nation, the bridges between West and East, French and English, newcomers to Canada and the native-born could not and could never be taken for granted. His majority mandates that came from Canadians, were about change. Canada's economy was in dire need of a conservative overhaul. So, there would be fiscal reform and the GST. I can't think of a more unpopular economic policy than the implementation of the GST. And yet, I can't think of a more popular economic policy with all the prime ministers and governments that followed in the steps of Brian Mulroney. And he would do more. Privatizations, deregulation, expenditure reduction. His government would dismantle the National Energy Program in the West, and he'd sign the Atlantic Accord in the East. He concluded the largest land claims agreement in Canadian history and created the territory of Nunavut. Canada won a seat on the United Nations Security Council. We embraced peacekeeping. In 1991, Canada went to war, and we fought next to our allies in the Gulf. We played a crucial role as the Berlin Wall fell and a new world, including a new Europe, dawned. We were the first Western nation to recognize a free and proud Ukraine. And in one of his greatest moments, Brian Mulroney united all Canadians with pride and resolve as he and our nation helped Nelson Mandela take the first walk to freedom. His international contributions did not end when he left office. He continued to offer invaluable advice and support to his successors. In the last weeks of his life, he entered the arena a final time, defending Israel and fighting anti-Semitism in a compelling speech he delivered in New York. The Right Honorable Brian Mulroney treated his political opponents with respect. He did not view them as enemies. They were opponents, but most importantly, they were also Canadian patriots. Brian Mulroney had and was, and as was said, a hero named Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who when he passed away was described as having a heart made for friendship. Much has been said and reported about how Brian Mulroney would reach out to other people. And I know that there's not a person in this basilica today whose life has not been touched by Brian.